Hello everyone. Plato on freedom. The liberation of the soul. Plato, student of Socrates and teacher of Aristotle, developed a rich and multifaceted conception of freedom that extends far beyond the political understanding of liberty prevalent in his time. For Plato, true freedom is not merely the absence of external constraint or the right to do as one pleases. Rather, it involves the liberation of the soul from ignorance, the governance of reason over desire, and the alignment of the individual with the good. His vision of freedom, articulated across dialogues such as the Republic, Phaedrus, Gorgias, and Phaedo, challenges both ancient and modern assumptions about what it means to be truly free. This exploration will examine Plato's conception of freedom through several interconnected dimensions: freedom as philosophical enlightenment, freedom as rational self-governance, freedom in relation to political structures, and freedom as the soul's transcendence of material constraints. Throughout, we will consider how Plato's understanding of freedom emerges from his metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical commitments, as well as from his historical context. Historical context: Athens in Plato's time. To understand Plato's conception of freedom, we must first situate him within the political and cultural environment of Athens in the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE. Plato was born into an aristocratic Athenian family shortly after the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BC, a devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta that ultimately ended with Athens' defeat. He grew up during the final years of Athens' golden age and witnessed the city's decline from imperial power to defeated state. This historical backdrop significantly influenced his political thought, including his views on freedom. The Athens of Plato's youth operated under a radical form of direct democracy, which granted extensive political rights to male citizens while excluding women, slaves, and resident foreigners. This democratic system emphasized isagoria, equal right to speak in the assembly, and isonomia, equality before the law, as fundamental to freedom. Citizens participated directly in legislation through the assembly, in administration through the Council of 500, and in judiciary functions through the people's courts. However, Plato's experience with Athenian democracy was deeply troubled. In 399 BCE, his mentor Socrates was tried and executed by the democratic regime on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. This traumatic event, occurring when Plato was around 28 years old, profoundly shaped his view of democratic governance and its relationship to true freedom. Furthermore, Plato had witnessed the excesses of democracy during the Peloponnesian War, including the disastrous Sicilian expedition and the execution of generals after the Battle of Arginusi. He had also observed two brief periods of oligarchic rule, the 404-11 BCE and the 30 tyrants in 404 to 403 BC, led by his relatives Critias and Charmides, which had proven equally problematic. These experiences contributed to Plato's skepticism about conventional political freedom. Neither democratic license nor oligarchic privilege appeared to foster genuine liberty. Consequently, Plato sought a deeper understanding of freedom rooted in philosophical insight rather than political arrangements. Freedom as philosophical enlightenment. Central to Plato's conception of freedom is his allegory of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic. This powerful image depicts ordinary humans as prisoners chained in a cave, mistaking shadows on the wall for reality. The philosopher is one who breaks free from these chains, ascends to the world outside, and eventually beholds the sun, symbolizing the form of the good, the ultimate source of all being and knowledge. This allegory illustrates Plato's view that true freedom begins with liberation from epistemological imprisonment. The prisoners in the cave are enslaved not primarily by physical chains, but by their ignorance, their inability to distinguish appearances from reality. As Plato has Socrates explain, then think what their release and healing from bonds and folly would be like if something like this came to pass by nature. Whenever one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his neck around, walk, and look up toward the light, he'd be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before. Republic 5:15c. This painful process of enlightenment represents genuine liberation, freedom from the tyranny of ignorance and illusion. For Plato, those who remain in the cave, even if politically free by conventional standards, are actually enslaved by their limited perception of reality. Only the philosopher who grasps the forms achieves authentic freedom. The pursuit of this freedom requires dialectic, Plato's method of philosophical inquiry through question and answer, which progressively leads the soul toward knowledge of the forms. In the Phaedrus, Plato describes dialectic as the process of division and collection, by which one comes to understand the natural articulations of reality. I am myself a lover of these divisions and collections, so that I may be able to speak and to think. And if I find any man who is able to see a one and many in nature, him I follow, and walk in his footsteps as if he were a god. Phaedrus 266b. Through dialectic, the philosopher achieves cognitive freedom, the capacity to comprehend reality beyond mere appearances and to organize knowledge according to natural rather than conventional categories. This intellectual liberation stands in stark contrast to the rhetorical education prevalent in democratic Athens, which Plato often portrays as teaching manipulation rather than truth-seeking. Freedom as rational self-governance beyond epistemological liberation, Plato conceives of freedom as the proper ordering of the soul under the governance of reason. In the Republic, he develops his tripartite model of the soul, comprising reason, spirit, or passion, and appetite. True freedom for Plato involves establishing the rightful rule of reason over the other elements, not their suppression, but their harmonious integration under rational direction. Plato illustrates this conception through his famous image of the charioteer reason, guiding two horses, one noble and good, spirit, and one wild and unruly, appetite. In the Phaedrus, he writes, "Let us then liken the soul to the natural union of a team of winged horses and their charioteer. With us men, however, it is as follows. First, our charioteer drives a pair. Moreover, one of his horses is noble and good, while the other has the opposite character, and so our driving is necessarily difficult and troublesome." Phaedrus 246ab. This image conveys Plato's understanding that freedom does not mean giving free rein to all desires, but rather establishing proper hierarchy and harmony within the soul. The person ruled by appetites, constantly driven by hunger, thirst, sexual desire, and greed, is not free but enslaved, regardless of their political status. As Socrates argues in the Republic, then the tyrannical man himself, his soul I mean, will be full of slavery and unfreedom, with the most decent parts enslaved, and with a small part, the maddest and most vicious, as their master. Republic 577d. True freedom, by contrast, comes through the rational self-governance that Plato terms sophrosyne, often translated as temperance or moderation. This virtue enables a person to be stronger than himself in the sense of establishing rational control over desires that would otherwise dominate. This Platonic conception challenges the democratic understanding of freedom as doing what one wants. In the Gorgias, Plato has Socrates debate with Callicles, who advocates precisely such a view. How can a man be happy if he's a slave to anyone at all? Rather, this is what's admirable and just by nature, that the man who will live correctly ought to allow his own appetites to get as large as possible and not restrain them. And when they are as large as possible, he ought to be competent to serve them. Gorgias 491e, 492a. Socrates systematically dismantles this position, arguing that the unrestrained pursuit of desire leads not to freedom, but to an unfillable leaky jar of constant want. True freedom requires not the maximization of desire, but its proper governance by reason. Freedom and political structures. Plato's understanding of freedom informs his critique of Athenian democracy and his vision of the ideal state as articulated primarily in the Republic. Unlike modern liberal thinkers who often view the state as a potential threat to individual freedom, Plato sees the properly organized state as enabling rather than constraining true freedom. In Book 8 of the Republic, Plato presents a typology of political constitutions, tracing their degeneration from aristocracy, rule by the best, through timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and finally tyranny. He characterizes democratic freedom as follows, "And the city is full of freedom and free speech, and there is liberty and freedom to do in it whatever one wants. And where there's liberty, it's clear that each man would organize his life in it privately just as it pleases him." Republic 557b. This apparent freedom, however, contains the seeds of its own destruction. Without proper education and rational constraints, democratic freedom degenerates into license, which eventually produces tyranny. The excess of liberty, whether in states or individuals, seems only to pass into excess of slavery. And so tyranny naturally arises out of democracy, and most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery out of the most extreme form of liberty. Republic 564a. Plato's ideal state, by contrast, establishes conditions for genuine freedom through its class structure and educational system. By organizing society according to natural abilities and providing appropriate education for each class, culminating in the philosophical training of the guardians, the ideal state enables each person to fulfill their proper function in harmony with others. Crucially, the guardians who rule this state achieve the highest form of freedom through their philosophical education and their liberation from private property and family ties. Unlike democratic leaders who are often enslaved to public opinion and personal ambition, Plato's philosopher kings serve out of duty rather than desire for power. Their freedom consists in their knowledge of the good and their capacity to order both their own souls and the state according to this knowledge. This vision suggests that political freedom properly understood is not about doing whatever one wants, but about living in a state ordered according to reason and justice. Such a state provides the conditions for the soul's liberation from ignorance and desire, the true freedom that Plato values above all. Freedom and the immortality of the soul. Plato's conception of freedom extends beyond political arrangements to encompass the soul's relationship to the body and its ultimate destiny. In dialogues such as the Phaedo, Plato presents death as the final liberation of the soul from bodily constraints. In the Phaedo, Socrates argues that the philosopher practices dying throughout life by separating the soul from bodily concerns as much as possible, and does purification not turn out to be the separation of the soul from the body as far as possible, and the habituation of the soul to assemble and gather itself together away from every part of the body, and to dwell by itself as far as it can both now and in the future, freed, as it were, from the bonds of the body. Phaedo 67 CE. This separation constitutes a form of freedom, liberation from the body's demands and limitations. The philosopher achieves partial freedom in life through contemplation of the forms, which requires temporary detachment from bodily sensation. Death completes this liberation, allowing the purified soul to dwell permanently in the realm of forms. In the Phaedrus, Plato elaborates this view through the myth of the soul's journey. The soul is depicted as naturally winged, but its wings are damaged by bodily existence. Through philosophical recollection and amnesis, the soul regrows its wings and regains the freedom to ascend to divine reality. The mind of the philosopher alone has wings, and this is just, for he is always, according to the measure of his abilities, clinging in recollection to those things in which God abides, and in beholding which he is what he is. Phaedrus 249c. This metaphysical dimension of freedom, the soul's capacity to transcend material constraints through recollection of the forms, underlies Plato's entire philosophical project. The dialectical method, the ethical emphasis on rational self-governance, and the political vision of the ideal state all serve this ultimate goal, the liberation of the soul from ignorance and desire, preparing it for eventual return to its true home in the realm of being. Plato's influence and contemporary relevance. Plato's conception of freedom has profoundly influenced subsequent philosophical traditions, from Neoplatonism through Christian theology to German idealism and beyond. His critique of democratic freedom and his emphasis on rational self-governance continue to challenge contemporary assumptions about liberty. Historical influence. The Neoplatonists, particularly Plotinus, developed Plato's metaphysical understanding of freedom as the soul's ascent toward the One. Christian thinkers like Augustine adapted Platonic ideas to argue that true freedom comes through subordination to God rather than through self-assertion, a perspective that dominated Western thought for centuries. During the Enlightenment, Kant's distinction between negative freedom, freedom from external constraint, and positive freedom, rational autonomy, echoes Platonic themes, as does Rousseau's distinction between natural liberty and moral liberty. Hegel's understanding of freedom as the recognition and overcoming of necessity similarly reflects Platonic influence. In the 20th century, Isaiah Berlin's famous distinction between negative and positive liberty revisits questions raised by Plato, particularly concerning whether freedom should be understood primarily as absence of constraint or as self-realization through rational governance. Critics of positive liberty, like Berlin himself, often warn that Platonic conceptions of freedom can justify authoritarian political arrangements, while defenders argue that Plato offers necessary correctives to purely negative understandings of freedom. Contemporary relevance. Plato's critique of democratic freedom remains startlingly relevant in contemporary democratic societies. His warning that unrestrained liberty eventually undermines itself resonates in an age of polarization, misinformation, and democratic backsliding. His insight that apparent freedom can mask deeper forms of enslavement speaks to contemporary concerns about manipulation through advertising, social media, and political rhetoric. Moreover, Plato's understanding of freedom as rational self-governance challenges the consumer model of freedom prevalent in modern capitalist societies. Against the view that freedom consists in maximizing choice and satisfying desires, Plato suggests that genuine freedom requires discriminating between worthy and unworthy desires and establishing rational control over the latter. Plato's educational vision also retains relevance for contemporary discussions of freedom. His insistence that true freedom requires systematic intellectual and moral development challenges both progressive educational approaches that emphasize self-expression without structure and conservative approaches that emphasize rote learning without philosophical inquiry. Finally, Plato's metaphysical understanding of freedom as the soul's transcendence of material constraints offers a counterpoint to reductive materialist accounts of human experience. In an age often characterized by scientific materialism, Plato's vision of the soul's capacity for liberation through philosophical contemplation provides an alternative framework for understanding human potential. Conclusion: Plato's conception of freedom integrates epistemological, ethical, political, and metaphysical dimensions into a comprehensive vision of human liberation. For Plato, true freedom involves escape from the cave of ignorance, establishment of rational governance over desire, participation in a justly ordered state, and ultimately, the soul's transcendence of bodily constraints. This understanding challenges superficial conceptions of freedom as mere absence of external constraint or license to follow desire. It suggests instead that genuine freedom requires discipline, education, and philosophical insight, a perspective that continues to challenge and enrich our understanding of liberty. In an age often characterized by confusion about the meaning and value of freedom, Plato's rigorous analysis offers valuable resources for rethinking what it means to be truly free. His vision reminds us that freedom worthy of the name involves not just liberation from external constraints, but also liberation from the internal bonds of ignorance, passion, and material attachment. In this sense, the Platonic understanding of freedom remains not merely historically significant, but urgently relevant to contemporary philosophical and political discourse. Thanks for watching.